I'm Mary Jo Morelli,
Yeah.
and my husband David is with me tonight, and we were founding members of Friends of Historic Forest Grove in Forest Grove in about 1989. So we've been around for 35-ish or more years, something like that. And we have stuck with it through many adventures. I guess I am primarily known for my involvement with the Alvin T. Smith House, which is a National Register house on the edge of Forest Grove.
What's the name of it?
The Alvin Thompson Smith House. And it was built in 1854 and was put on the National Register in 1974.
Is that the one over in Kinnaman?
No, Kinnaman's right over here.
Okay.
That's relevant for tonight. So, and I have been involved with the Smith House. I'll give you very briefly my background on that. In 1991, when I was chair of the Historic Landmarks Board in Forest Grove, I opened up the newspaper one day, and there was a picture of the Smith House and an article, a description of it being annexed into the city of Forest Grove. But I felt, as chair of the Landmarks Board, I should have known what was going on with this. And so it just spurred me, and I started making some contacts and found out that the city of Forest Grove and Metro were planning to put a garbage transfer station on the side of the house. With a number of meetings, a series of meetings that went on, the transfer station location was changed to B Street because there was federal funding involved in this building of the transfer station. And at that time, I don't know if it's really still true today. Is it? It is. It's just a little known fact that federal funding cannot be used to diminish a National Register structure. And that is a big benefit of getting a structure listed. And it's unfortunate that banks had not done that with what they've gone through recently. Well, things kind of settled, and we all went on with our things. But in 2001, I got a call again, and this was a attorney who'd been made conservator of a trust, and I'd been recommended as a contact, and he said, well, you know, what house are you looking for? He said, well, that old house on the south side of Forest Grove. I said, okay, why do you want to know? He said, well, the fire department's doing a practice burn.
I don't think so.
And I said, I don't think so. And that same attorney helped Friends of Historic Forest Grove to go through a process that allowed us to purchase the Smith House. And we had a private lender who loaned in the community, who loaned us the money. We went through many fundraisers. We cleared our debt on that. And a lot of things have happened since then. But that's how I got so involved, and as years pass, I'm surprised how many years have passed, and I am now the manager of the Alvin T. Smith House and property. And we have we just signed a contract for our next project, which will be starting, we believe will be starting next week. And but I'm really engrossed in the history of Forest Grove, and not just Forest Grove, but Washington County. And Judy and I met many years ago, and it was at a Washington County roundtable. And everybody would go around and tell about what we were doing, and I mentioned the Alvin T. Smith house, and Judy popped up and said, would that be called Almighty Smith? And I said, well, yes, it would. And she said, oh, wait a minute. Don't go away. I wasn't going away. But she came back with a story of that Thomas Denny had told to his family about the rainy night when Alvin Smith happened to show up at his house in a storm. And Thomas Denny thought that it was very funny that Alvin Smith had to trek through all that water because it was more of a Baptist immersion in baptism was more of a thing for the Baptists than it was for the Congregationalists. And so she provided me with that story, and I have copies of it out at the Smith House and refer to it periodically. Maybe someday it'll get published. But that's how Judy.
Well, actually, I will tell you one thing, where that mud and water, I mean, it's Oregon, and it's right over there behind, well, it's the pepper mill is still there, so that is where he was. But there was actually quicksand there, so I really wonder if it was just mud or if it was quicksand, you know?
Well, he helped Alvin out of it.
It did,
Don
exactly.
Smith came through on that one,
Yeah.
one way or another. Anyway, but I'm going to tell you a totally different story tonight. I write everything out. I'm not always really good at following what I write, but I try to get it into my head. So, and a lot of the things that I do, my years of exploring the settlement history of Washington County are based on Alvin Smith's diaries. I have the most complete transcription of his diaries, and my husband and I actually have done some of the transcriptions of portions that had not been done that we felt were particularly relevant, and have really, within the past year, some of that information has been really exciting and important to reaching beyond, back into the past and bringing it forward to the future. That's complex, but it's good. So, I did go through some of the diary today. Part of it has been indexed, so I could look up names. Other parts of it have not been indexed. The other source is this book right here. Washington County, Politics and Community in Antebellum America. This is our Washington County. Have any of you read this book?
Well,
Okay.
yeah, I've looked.
It's not an easy read. It's not an easy read. But I keep going back to it time after time. I will pass it around. Please do make sure it gets back to me. Oh, good, I do have my little stamp in there. This, and I reference it as a tome in my talk because the detail in this is really quite incredible. And in spite of all that, there is extensive information on the people who came here, when they came, why they came, where they came from, and that encompasses why they settled in the parts of Washington County that they did choose for their homes. And Washington County is certainly a lot more than the Tualatin Plains. It incorporates the surrounding hills and mountains, and the entirety of the county is involved in the details that are in this book. And we're going to focus on an example of the diverse roots that existed in the 1840s and the 1850s of those very early people who came here. And so, to begin,
we had Washington County before Oregon became a state.
yes, but we're not going to talk about all the county pieces tonight because that is its own story. So here, by the 1840s, we had the Native Americans of the Kalapuya tribe who were the Atfalti. And that population had been devastated, as a lot of you I'm sure know, by the early exposure to diseases that had come in with white people who had traversed the region. And those arriving by sea and land in the area, we can reference the Lewis and Clark expedition and some of the other government survey groups that had come through, as well as the people involved in the fur trade, the mountain men, and the fur trappers, as well as ships that are documented who have landed along the Oregon coast in early times. And the mixed races that were here in the county. A lot of those fur trappers, mountain men, had married Indian women and brought the women, their wives and their children with them, as the Hudson's Bay Company and the American Fur Company were downsizing their operations with the trapping out of the fur, the availability of fur. And then the missionaries came with religion to convert the native peoples to Christianity, teach them farming, and to educate those people. And what is now apparently the correct phrase to use for those who came on the wagon trains are the overlanders. Has anybody else heard that term?
Yeah.
Okay, because I attended a workshop a year or so ago, and that was really stated as the proper phrase. I don't think a lot of us, at least maybe I can just say our era, that will ever really adapt to that, but I made an effort here. And those all had to do with the western expansion of the United States. And initially it was small groups who came, but as we know, by 1843 the trail was really opening, and the largest migration began throughout the next 10-15 years, and on until I've read of people who still came by wagon after 1900. So it's been a long time that those have been going on.
I have cousins that came from Virginia in 1959. They have 8 kids, and they rode in the back of a coal truck all the way across.
Oh, there they are. Determined people. There have been a lot of them who've come to Oregon and have come to Washington County. But I'm going to be focusing on 2 families whose migration falls in this last group. But which will draw, and from that, there are pieces that, of course, touch those earlier people who'd come in different forms of the migration. So I'm going to begin with Andrew Jackson Masters. And with his wife and her extended family, they moved north from the southern border states, seeking some advantages that could be gained with a fresh start. Depleted soils in the deep south were making it more and more difficult for people who didn't have large acreages to succeed, and so the Masters and extended family went up to Missouri and joined that 1843 wagon train. And upon arrival on the Tualatin Plains, Masters first bought a claim from a Frenchman. And he was likely a Hudson's Bay employee, and his wife was an Indian. Well, Masters and his wife were concerned about a decision involving an Indian who apparently the couple were somewhat estranged, so it didn't seem like a very good thing to be doing, and I don't know that he paid very much. I doubt if he paid much, but they moved on and were in the area that's now Farmington for a period of time, and still it was just too isolated, and they joined up. They moved up to north of the Hillsborough area and were near another family that had been on the wagon train with them. But finally they found a location that they were happy with. And they found it was 2 miles long and a half-mile wide. And on that property they raised cattle and horses. And that is just right out here, right? The Master's house.
Wow.
Okay. I'll make sure that you realize who and what I'm talking about. And so they were settled there, but they did not settle for long. They were drawn to California and the gold rush. They gathered up their 2 remaining surviving children and went to Suttersville, where they opened a successful hotel, and about a year later, they sold out, purchased goods that they knew they would need on their return to the farm, and what money they had raised, and they boarded a ship back to Portland. Unfortunately, the ship wrecked on the Columbia River Bar,
Oh, golly.
but the Masters family survived with $10,000 intact. And so, returning to their farm operations in Washington County, they opened a tavern and went on with their farm operations. Now, the initial 6 months journey created deep bonds within the families of those immigrant families, and they maintained those relationships after arrival. They would act as character witnesses for one another when occasion arose, and there were times when even financial bonds needed to be placed in order to, which demonstrates the strength of many of those relationships. By 1850, land between Masters Claim and Hillsborough was only sparsely occupied by families with similar backgrounds who had previously resided in rural settings and sought similar living situations in Washington County. They needed the services of a town such as Hillsborough, but led really fairly isolated lives and depended upon one another in their extended families. Now we'll leave Mr. Masters for a bit and his family, and I'll just tell you about James H. McMillan. He was born in New York in 1823. When 11 years old, his family moved to Illinois, which was part of what was then the Northwest Territories. It is likely that that a family member, either father or grandfather, received bounty land for service in either the Revolutionary War or the War of 1812. By the age of 22, James had learned the skills of a millwright and moved to Missouri, where he worked until joining a wagon train west in 1845. Again, as with the Masters, the people he met on that journey became lifelong friends. Another important aspect of this story is that it was common for young single men in a family to make the move west and send back for family or to go back and bring the family west. This was typical of urban families from the Northeast who had training in a profession. And here's an example, local example, and that's Tabitha Brown's family. Her eldest son, Oris, traveled west, and after finding land on the West Tualatin Plain, returned to Missouri to bring his family to the west. So upon arrival, McMillan's skills as a millwright served him very well, as he quickly got a job for George Abernathy at his mill in Oregon City. This connection again served him as he became a part of the Oregon Cavalry, which went to rescue survivors from the Whitman Mission, and gained him the status of captain, which he used, became a distinguishing factor for him throughout the rest of his life. McMillan had married but lost his wife after the birth of her child in Oregon City. McMillan also went successfully to the gold fields of California in March of 1849, returning in December with $8,000. He took up a large claim on the East Plain and purchased additional land until he owned about 900 acres. McMillan welcomed his extended family in 1851, and soon after their arrival, married Tirsa Barton, whose family arrived on the same wagon train as his family, and the Bartons also purchased land near McMillan's many acres. McMillan's parents and his twin sisters, and their husbands moved to Forest Grove. And there's the skills that they brought in just many trades were a huge contribution to the early development of Forest Grove. The name Stephen and Parthena Blank would be some of those names, as well as the sisters. I just blanked on who they married, but anyway, they were in Forest Grove for generations, and a couple of those houses that they lived in are on the National Register in Forest Grove. So Hillsborough and Forest Grove were the commercial hubs outside of Portland. These communities had populations that could support the surrounding agriculture. Settlement on land farther to the east of Hillsborough was slow and sparse, but the names of those of sentiment, were filling in after the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850 on what would later become Beaverton. Some of the names were Hall, Williams, Elliott, Fano, and Denny. Significant in the story is that the McMillan's land was adjacent to Masters, and the Barton land was nearby. Cultural and political differences soon became apparent. Masters ran a tavern. The McMillans and Bartons were temperance people, and many abolitionists had arrived in Washington County at that time. It was Masters' treatment of a young Indian boy who had come into his care that caused emotions to rise amongst neighbors, including McMillan, who considered Masters to be unlawfully extorting labor from the boy, effectively enslaving him. Matters escalated and caused hard feelings among neighbors. Masters was called before a judge for his threatening words to his neighbors. Bonds were required to ensure his peaceful and good behavior, and several of his friends stepped up to support him financially to receive that bond, to establish that bond. This extensive background takes us to a day, an October day in 1856. And the first chapter in the book, Washington County, Politics and Community in Antebellum America, tells us this story. And I will quote from the book here. On the morning of October 11th, 1856, Andrew Jackson Masters set out on horseback to travel a short distance from his large farm some miles east of the village of Hillsborough to the nearby property of Edward Barton, where a campground was being prepared for a revival meeting. Along the road that bordered their two properties, Masters met his immediate neighbor, James McMillan. An altercation occurred that was audible to the Bartons and others at the campgrounds. A shot was fired from McMillan's shotgun, and Masters sustained a mortal wound. It's the end of the quote. McMillan was taken into custody and brought before a justice of the peace in Forest Grove on October 17th. He was released on bail of $20,000, paid by 7 of his friends, and directed to appear before a judge in Portland in May of 1857, many months later. After testimony in June of 1857, testimony of over 60 witnesses, he was acquitted at a grand jury trial. Of course, this is not the end of the story. In the course of this research, I came upon a word that was used to come to a decision of guilt or not in this case. Heuristic. Is anybody else familiar with the word heuristic? This book. It is a mental shortcut that allows an individual to make a decision, pass judgment, or to solve a problem quickly and with minimal mental effort. And that apparently applies to the way in which this acquittal was decided. So, why did I share this episode of conflict and perhaps murder? Well, as a person with fascination or passion, you might say, for local history, the answer is likely founded in being the 5th generation of a family who came to this area, arrived in Oregon in 1852. I grew up on the windy side of Portland. That would be Gresham. And lived as a child on part of the family DLC. The family lore was often a discussion at family gatherings, and afterward there would be evaluations of the accuracy and or truth of those discussions. Then I would wander up to the attic where all the remains of the lives of the remains of the lives of those people being discussed resided. There is a lot to learn, but always not a lot unknown about the people who came before us. Upon moving to Forest Grove and building upon my earlier speculations, I found myself in a fertile field for understanding Oregon history from a far different perspective. And this perspective was supported by this book written by 2 men from Australia. So that outside perspective is often more insightful than from what we think is that experience that we get through our families. There's a lot to learn. Okay, those missionaries and settlers who came to Oregon the decade before the California Gold Rush in 1849 and the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850 had very different motivations. Those people came from very different geographic locations and cultures. After having been united in fighting an enemy to claim their own freedom, the people who arrived after the New Northwest became the Old Northwest. Americans were once again on the move to new opportunities. The later arrivals, merging from so many diverse cultures within the United States of the 1850s, did not come to reestablish their prior homes as had the rural southern settlers of the 1840s or the northeasterners of more urbanized settings. Opportunities seemed endless, and the large numbers of immigrants brought vastly different perspectives. Village or town. Forest Grove on the West Plain had a powerful impact with a high percentage of well-educated and religious people of similar backgrounds. Their ideals for the future were ambitious. In 1850, the census shows that there were more people with religious and highly educated backgrounds than there were farmers in the area. Hillsborough, as the county seat, drew the surrounding inhabitants for specific purposes, for brief visits, to do business, those kinds of things, because they quickly returned to their farms, which were their sustenance. How different these communities are today. The rapid pace of our lives today can be challenging, and community changes that have taken place over the years challenged each of us and our generations before us. Consideration of differing cultures, political opinions it's all still relevant today. So I want to encourage appreciation of the resources we have that remind us of who and what came before us. The Master's House is near where we are meeting tonight, owned by the city of Hillsborough. There are dedicated people, many here tonight I think, who are working hard to retain the remnants of our heritage on these Tualatin Plains in Washington County, Oregon. So villages or towns or metropolis. This is where we are today, and thank you, Judy, for inviting me, and I hope what I've shared with you has been relevant in some way to you.
It's awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, got it.